Hello, my name is Nicholas Morgan, and I'm an editor at Aval News, and this is Turkey Abroad. Joining me today from London in the UK is Sarah Clark, head of the Europe and Central Asia program at Article 19. Good morning, Sarah. I'm glad to have you.
Good morning, Nikolai. I'm glad to be here.
So last week, Facebook announced that it would be sending a representative to Turkey under the newly revised Internet Law number 5651. And now it is at this point the biggest company that's not complying with this piece of legislation. So really what I want to ask you, Sarah, is what is your reaction to this development? How serious is it to you that Facebook is now contributing to this law with its compliance?
So thanks, Nikolai. Well, we were at Article 19 and across freedom of expression and human rights organizations, we expressed our deep disappointment in Facebook's decision to comply with the latest regulations and amendments to the law. So this means that Facebook will appoint a local representative in Turkey to comply with this draconian new social media law. And we've seen companies one by one, like dominoes, comply with this law over the last number of weeks, especially as an advertising ban for social media platforms with over 1 million daily users who have failed to comply with the requirement that they establish representation in the country was set to come into force. So this ban would effectively prevent anyone from advertising on these platforms and would have led to a significant loss of revenue. So what we've seen is Facebook, along with YouTube and a number of other social media platforms, really go against their own standards, their own commitments to freedom of expression, and agree, in effect, to become an instrument of state censorship. So this has a huge impact on the rights and safety of their users. And we had been calling on social media companies not to contribute to Turkey's censorship of online content and not to expose users to the risk of arbitrary arrest and prosecution by the handing over of their data to Turkish authorities. But unfortunately, Facebook and others have decided to go ahead and appoint local representatives. So we're particularly worried that they will, in effect, become the long arm of the Turkish authorities in implementing censorship.
On that note, Facebook seemed to at least have that in mind when they made the announcement that they would be sending a representative to Turkey, and they said that they would not do anything that violates the company's own values, and that if they felt as if they were going to be forced to do so, they would simply leave the country altogether. But they do seem, they and a lot of the other social media companies, for that matter, they seem to be between a rock and a hard place where they have to balance protecting user rights to privacy, freedom of expression, but at the same time they are threatened with fines, advertising bans, and even shrinking just their broadband or bandwidth rather to essentially force them out of the country if they're not going to leave on their own. Is there a best way forward for these companies here, or is there any assurance that they can offer that to their users really on protecting their privacy in Turkey?
Yes, so we recognize what a difficult situation social media companies have been put in because of Turkey's law. What we're calling on those companies who've decided to appoint a representative is to immediately disclose the specific steps that they're going to take to respect the right of freedom of expression and privacy of their users, because we know that they will undoubtedly face pressure from the authorities and a lack of an independent judiciary. So we'd like to know what their red lines will be, where and when they will decide that they will not be turning over information. I mean, they have said, as you mentioned, that they will not be providing private data to the Turkish authorities. But we have a long history of experience with the Turkish authorities, and we know that that's going to be extremely difficult. So we would call on those companies to make public what the red lines are and how exactly they're going to protect the rights of users in the Turkish context.
You also mentioned the lack of judicial independence in Turkey, which at this point has been eroding for well over a decade now. But in the last few weeks or months or so now, they have been speaking up about this idea that they're going to undergo a series of reforms, including judicial reforms. But is this some? How seriously do you think that pledge should be taken? And do you really think that this is an area that the Turkish government might compromise on in any way?
I think we would love to see meaningful judicial reform, and that's what we've been pushing for, in particular since the imposition of the state of emergency in July 2016. And as you mentioned, the almost total decimation of the independence of the judiciary. However, when you look at the evidence of the independence of the judiciary, in particular over recent months, and the refusal of the Turkish judiciary to uphold European Court of Human Rights decisions, particularly on Osman Kavala, a leading Turkish philanthropist, and Selahattin Demirtas, the leader of the Kurdish party, we see that the Turkish judiciary are not at all in compliance with international human rights law, and that they're not making independent decisions. And so the practice is completely at odds with Turkey's stated commitments to reform. And we've seen that in a number of instances since they've launched the judicial reform package. We've seen numerous attempts by the authorities to present a form of window dressing to the international community to secure trust from international investors in particular. However, we've seen no concrete or meaningful evidence that the independence of the judiciary is indeed being restored.
So over the week, you mentioned the state of emergency, and over the weekend, I spoke to Dr. Asli Telli. She was covering the state of digital rights inside Turkey and for years, and she suggested that it was during the state of emergency after the coup attempt in 2016 that really heightened this crackdown and made the internet the forefront of this battle between the government and its perceived internal enemies, which very often just end up being those who disagree with it. So, how do you think that the impact of the state of emergency is still playing out today, even though it was the state of emergency itself was ended about 2 or 3 years ago by now?
Mhm. Well, if you look at the constitutional amendments that were passed in the wake of the state of emergency, in particular in the appointment of judges and prosecutors, if you think of the thousands of judges and prosecutors who were summarily dismissed during the state of emergency and were replaced by pro-government judges and prosecutors, we see that the whole edifice of the judiciary in Turkey since the state of emergency has been radically altered. Um, and unfortunately, that has meant very lasting implications in terms of a complete lack of independence of judges and prosecutors. And we see this all the time in the types of decisions that judges are making, as you mentioned, in particular with regard to critics, journalists, human rights lawyers, civil society activists, academicians. We've seen the whole scale dismissal of thousands of civil servants who have never had an independent or impartial appeals process. And we see the ongoing prosecutions of journalists and other civil society actors on vague, overly broad terrorism charges with virtually no evidence to support these convictions. So the impact of the state of emergency is very much with us still because of these reforms. Many of the many of the measures that were brought in under the state of emergency were then placed on a legal footing. So they're there transcribed into law. And as you mentioned, we've just seen an acceleration of repression when it comes to forms of expression, both online and offline.
Mm. Of course, the government would like to say that this update to the bill has to do with combating cybercrime or improving national security, and they use that to justify some of the measures like quote unquote throttling to shut down companies during emergency situations. But is there actually any public security reason for this law, or do you think it doesn't justify the acts that they're committing to enforce it online that infringe on privacy?
Yes, I think the amendments as we see them are indeed a pretext to shut down critical voices. For example, doctors and medical workers who are criticizing the state response to COVID. We see the same with journalists who are reporting on corruption. We see the same law used to repress civil society and their reporting. So while the stated aim may be to combat terrorism, it is so vaguely worded and so overbroad that it is used in effect to repress all dissent. If the state wanted to really target terrorism in a narrowly defined and clearly circumscribed way, the law would have been worded in a much more specific legal and proportionate manner. And this is an issue that Article 19 has raised about Turkey's terrorism laws in general for decades. It is the fact that they are so widely and vaguely worded that they can be then used in order to prosecute virtually anybody who disagrees with the authorities as terrorists.
You are covering for Article 19 a big region from Europe to the former Soviet Union, and Turkey's not alone in these draconian, in a sense, in internet laws. I mean, we see it already over the weekend with what's happening in Russia with Alexei Navalny returning and the government targeting social media users with any variety of crimes under their own laws. And we've seen similar tightenings in places like Belarus or in Central Asia. And Turkey seems to be fitting into a pattern there. What is this pattern that we're seeing emerge in this neighborhood? How would you identify it?
So I think you're absolutely right. What we have seen over the last decade is the burgeoning of social media, which has enabled and expanded greatly the ability of individual citizens to access information and to hold their governments to account. Concurrently, we've seen governments recognize the power of social media, and they've broadened what was already historically repressive practices against the published press to the online sphere, so as to repress and control and censor these forms of criticism, forms of protest and of organizing. I think you mentioned rightly Russia, Belarus, Central Asia. What we've seen across all of those states is a pattern, in particular of the last number of years, of a very focused crackdown on online expression, be that prosecuting journalists and other civil society actors for quote unquote terrorism or extremist or insightful behavior, purely on the basis of expression that we would see as critical of government policy. Likewise, we've seen full internet shutdowns in places like Belarus, which was the first time we'd seen a full internet shutdown in Europe during the elections in August. And we've seen the ongoing focus on shutting down and limiting the ability of protesters to organize on channels such as Telegram, which have played such a massive role in enabling and allowing for the protests, both in Belarus, but also in places like Russia, where individuals now organize. And we've seen at times Western internet companies being compliant in some of these shutdowns. For example, we have an Austrian internet company who provides internet services in Belarus. They have been complicit in internet shutdowns. So therefore, we've seen the complicity of Western companies in massive human rights violations in many of these countries. So that's something that Article 19 and our partners are closely monitoring and are raising before international mechanisms, the EU, the UN, the Council of Europe, and with the social media companies themselves, that they do have obligations. They have very clear business and human rights obligations. They have obligations to their users not to be complicit in human rights violations.
You mentioned the complicity in some cases of several Western internet companies in these measures, and I haven't seen, at least so far, too many Western politicians or governments themselves really speak out against, say, laws like 5651 in Turkey. But we do know that in some cases, companies can be pressured not to comply to these kind of measures. It makes me think about Project Dragonfly in China from Google, and how the US government was able to encourage them through condemnation and criticism to back away from that kind of move. Why, though, is there this comparable silence when it comes to Turkey?
I think that's quite a hard question to answer. This law, like many others, was rushed through Parliament in Turkey in summer of last year. There's a huge number of competing priorities when it comes to Turkey for Western states. Chief among them, the migration situation and the refugee deals between Turkey and the EU. Turkey is obviously a key NATO member, and there are a lot of security concerns and security priorities amongst many of the Western states when it comes to Turkey. And so I think what we often see is states making very realpolitik style decisions when it comes to trying to appease the Turkish authorities in the hopes that there won't be a backlash, that there won't be further repression. You see a huge amount of encouragement of Turkey whenever they do commit to judicial reforms or improving the human rights situation. But there's very few penalties for when Turkey doesn't follow through. Now, we are seeing the beginning of sanctions being taken against Turkey, and that's something which we may see more of in the future. But as it stands, we're now in a scenario where Turkey has very clearly and very boldly refused to implement some of the most important decisions from the European Court of Human Rights. And we're not seeing enough consequences for their failure to implement these decisions.
Mm-hmm. So I did see that Article 19 was very quick to call out Facebook's decision to send a representative to Turkey under the newly revised law, and a few other organizations also have been speaking out against it, like Amnesty International, for instance. I would like to ask you though, Sarah, what is it that NGOs like Article 19 and others, what is it that you guys are working on right now to really protect users who might be impacted by these decisions and laws like 5651?
Mhm. So when it comes to direct advocacy with the social media companies, we are now pushing very strongly for Facebook and others to make it clear what measures they are taking to protect their users' rights. And we're monitoring those decisions and that documentation very closely. And we will continue in our public advocacy to pressure Facebook and others into releasing in much more information about the measures they're taking and the red lines that they have in place. We'll also be continuing to um, push for Turkey to be held accountable in relation to these types of laws at international bodies such as the EU, the UN, the Council of Europe, and in the reset of bilateral relations with the US. We're very aware that the new administration in the United States places a much higher regard on human rights and in particular on freedom of expression online. So we'd like to see that reflected in US policy towards Turkey as they reset relations. So we'll be continuing our work in pushing the likes of the US, but also the EU to have much stronger responses in place for when Turkey passes laws such as this. At the user level, we work at challenging these laws through strategic litigation in the Turkish and the regional courts. And we also work to provide advice to users on their digital safety.
Sarah, it was excellent to have you on this morning, and I really do hope that we can chat again sometime soon. I also want to wish you the best of luck with all your work going forward, and really appreciate you taking the time to join Turkey Abroad.
Thank you for having me.
My name is Nicholas Morgan, and this is Turkey Abroad.